We start this podcast with Martin Arostegui to talk about the synthetic drugs processed in China and others. But first, we talk about the Ukraine and how they evolving this war in Ukraine. For talk about the Martin, first to present him. Martin Arostegui is special in military intelligence. Martin Arostegui is a renowned and highly experienced journalist, especially in military and intelligence matters, who has covered the king of international conflicts. We are now seeing deploying in Ukraine. He has worked for Wall Street Journal, Voice of America, the Daily Telegraph, the Washington Times, CNN, Fox News, United Press International, and France 24. And he's author of a book about military special operation called Twilight Warriors. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for sharing everything about every podcast about international security, law, international law, compliance, anti-corruption, anti-crime. Thank you all, and we start with Martin Arostegui.
Hi, Christian. Good afternoon. How are you? Glad to be on board. Glad to see you as usual. There is this incredible news from Southeast Asia. In fact, do have the figures ready because the growth of the drug traffic from the Golden Triangle into Southeast Asian and all Asian countries in general has been phenomenal. I mean, we're talking about a astronomical growth in the amount of synthetic drugs, methamphetamines. I know fentanyl is also on the list. But anyway, methamphetamines and other synthetic drugs, which are being increasingly trafficked into Asia from the renowned Asian triangle, consisting of Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. So we'll talk about that later. But I think first of all, we have to start with with what is happening in Ukraine. Which I think has to be, again, I see my job here as interpreting what is going on, getting beyond the comfortable headline, okay, or the headline that everyone assumes to be the case. The popular headline, put it that way. Analysts over the past week or so have said, and I agree up to a point, that the battle in Donbass, or the evolving conflict in the Donbass region, the campaign, the military conflict in Donbass is going Russia's way. That Russia is managing to gradually exhaust Ukraine's forces, that is gaining ground gradually, and that its superiority in numbers and in artillery is coming to bear in an area where, of course, the Ukrainians are much more exposed. However, and the news this week is that the Russians have taken Donetsk city that they've been struggling to take in over the past couple of weeks, over more of all of the province of Luhansk, an area which I would add control to start with. I mean, they shouldn't be fighting 3 months to take control of Luhansk. Supposedly, that was a pro-Russian area under the partial control of separatists that wanted to align with Russia, and they should have had this from the start of the war. But it's taken them it's taken them 3 months since the war started to assert control over Luhansk. And still, although it is reported that they have taken Severodonetsk, the reports I'm getting from, all right, I admit it is Ukrainian sources, but still they're pretty credible, is that while the Russians have occupied most of the city, The Ukrainian units, much of the Ukrainian army there, the regular forces there were able to retreat to high ground across the river, made an orderly tactical retreat from where they continue capable of harassing, bombing, and eventually perhaps retaking at least part of Zvezda-Donetsk, if they manage to cause sufficient losses and to the Russian occupying forces in that area, which are under a lot of pressure. Not only are the Ukrainian regular units able to continue to harass them from higher ground, I may add, which is very difficult to get to, which is more difficult to get to. But there also apparently there's a lot of house-to-house fighting going on inside the city. So basically, they are adopting the guerrilla type tactics, special forces type tactics, which were so effective in preventing the Russians from taking Kiev and Kharkiv and other areas of Russia in Zvezda-Donetsk, and which I may add also made it prolonged the siege of Mariupol over months of fighting. So if this is the scenario that the Russians have in Zvezda-Donetsk, if this is going to be Mariupol 2, Mariupol 2, I may add, complicated by the fact that the Ukrainian forces that had managed to retreat across the river and into higher ground have supply lines and are able to at any time penetrate Russian defenses into Zvezda-Donetsk again, or may do so at a later stage when they're reinforced, maybe by the long-range artillery and heavier artillery that's reaching them from the United States and other NATO countries, mainly the United States. They could conceivably, Ukraine may be conceivably in a position to retake Zvezda-Donetsk in the next weeks or months. So it all stands at very much of a stalemate. I mean, I'm not saying Ukraine is winning by any means. I see it very unlikely that the Ukrainians will, even assuming that they retake the city, that they will be able to make substantial progress against gains that the Russians have already made. But it is possible that Russia may get to may have been forced to the negotiating table without having yet taken total control of the Donbass region, which of course would put them in a very weak position. I doubt if Putin would agree to negotiations without being able to claim control of Donbass. In fact, he will probably do so even if he does not control the entire region, assuming, I mean, one of the scenarios being mentioned now is that Putin could at some point declare a unilateral ceasefire and claim all of Eastern Ukraine to be his, and therefore a peace agreement would take hold from that premise. That's possible. It would be quite a diplomatic coup for Putin if he did that. But whether he will be able to control all of Eastern Ukraine sufficiently to the point that he can actually do that is quite frankly in doubt at this stage, especially since the United States did release these HIMAR rockets, these HIMAR rocket systems, which are long-range rocket artillery systems, able to hit Russian positions from up to 50 kilometers away, which would give certainly the Ukrainians the capability to check any further substantial Russian advances into areas that into hostile areas at this stage. Okay. Mind you, in controlling Zvezda-Donetsk, which will be a long, drawn-out battle, this can be a long, drawn-out urban battle. The Russians will count with undoubtedly the Chechen shock units, maybe some of the Hezbollah people, the people from the hand-picked Spetsnaz units, maybe from the Wagner group, who will conduct house-to-house fighting, will systematically eliminate resistant cells, will slaughter any civilians, there are very few left there, but anyway, the few thousand civilians that are left there, suspected of aiding Ukrainian defenders, Ukrainian special forces units, Ukrainian guerrilla-type units that are operating in the city. But it will be a long haul. And the Russians, it's not going to be easy for them to control Zvezda-Donetsk, which many mainstream media outlets had given up had practically given it for granted that the Russians had taken and occupied Severodonetsk. This is going to be a very long, drawn-out battle. And controlling this city will decide ultimately whether Putin goes to the negotiating table or claiming control of the Donbass. Okay, without this, he cannot claim control of the Donbass. He cannot even claim control of Luhansk. So Russia is going to put all it can into doing this, but it will be a long, drawn-out battle. It will consume a lot of Russia's resources.
That's very good news for this week. Is the possible for the ID, the first country who ID is United States, no? That's the more important ID for Ukraine and take a control for Donbass, no? That's very interesting. And what you think is possible negotiation with Putin in this moment, or is close to the negotiation? Well,
I don't think they're close, Christian. I don't think Putin yet. I said I don't think he's yet in a military position. I don't think his forces on the ground are yet positioned in a way that he can claim control of as much Ukrainian territory as he wants to go to the negotiating table with. And the Ukrainians certainly are not going to negotiate at this stage or make any concessions, especially having received these new rocket artillery systems from the United States, which gives them a tremendous edge on the battlefield, a significant edge. Of course, Putin can retaliate in other ways. He launched a missile attack into Kiev this weekend, I think this morning. Although he did not hit the target that they intended to hit, they thought he was hitting a depot of tanks that the Ukraine had recently received from NATO, but they ended up, according to the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, they hit a train repairing some sort of center for the warehouse for trains that needed reparation, something like that. It was not the lucrative military target that Russia thought it had hit. And I would believe the Ukrainian side on this. The situation, the Ukrainians neither can they overplay their hand, Christian. There's a lot of pressure for them to negotiate. The NATO is very divided on this, okay? France and Germany and Italy, the three major NATO countries other than Britain, all want and are pushing for a negotiated solution. They're all talking to Putin about it, and they're trying to pressure Zelensky about it. All Europe has to do is just say, all right, we don't give you any more weapons, we don't give you any more, we reduce or diminish support unless you negotiate with Putin according to the terms he's outlined. If Putin outlines terms that the Europeans ultimately consider to be acceptable, that's another factor. But it'll be very difficult for the United States to keep supporting Ukraine unilaterally. And I would add that the decision to release these rocket artillery systems, the HIMARS, to Ukraine involved a lot of infighting within the Biden administration. There were a lot of people who were against it, including initially Biden himself, who initially objected to the systems going to Ukraine until I think he was pressured into it either by state or defense or a combination of the two, or I don't know exactly who. But his advisors ultimately prevailed upon him to go ahead with this. Otherwise, I think they probably would have told him that Ukraine's position would become untenable. Okay, that they would have to, that Ukraine could not hold out against any major Russian advance without these systems. So Ukraine's position is difficult. They don't control their own weapon supply. They don't. They will ultimately have to give in to whatever diplomatic settlement NATO and the United States pushes them into accepting.
Yeah, it's 100 days. 100 days ago, the first invasion of Russia is more is different the position of Ukraine. No? Really.
Yeah. Well, it's again. 100 days. Russia should have a lot more to show for 100 days of fighting. Again, I repeat, it's amazing. They don't even have Luhansk. This is an area that Russia was going to annex. It was an area that was supposedly a pro-Russian region of Ukraine. It was an area that whose independence Russia was going to recognize, which is the reason perhaps why they decided to go for Kiev before going for these separatist provinces, because they weren't sure how much control they could exercise over these separatist provinces if Ukraine was going to resist. So yes, I mean it's remarkable. Still, I mean, even though at a point in which things appear to be going Russia's way on the battlefield, they are still quite far from achieving any decisive objectives, any decisive victories, even in a region that they're, as I say, repeat, that they're already supposed to control. Okay. Now, where the Russians do seem to be making a lot of progress, and where they're winning, is exactly where we thought that they would lose, which is the economic front. Christian, things are fine for Russia economically, at the moment at least. I mean, the statistics are amazing. I mean, the ruble continues to trade in at 2-year highs, okay? It is completely stabilized. It has not lost its value. It has not lost its acquisitive value in Russia. People are still be able to use rubles, there's nothing like the Weimar type inflation that was predicted initially. If they have inflation, so does Europe and the United States. I mean, we're talking about 10% inflation in the West right now. So economically, Russia's doing quite well. Not only that, and this is, I think, the most significant, and what is most significant, I mean, the sanctions policy has been a failure. Yes, it's affected certain industries. It's a certain, all right, fine. They don't have Hyatt Hotel in Moscow anymore. They don't have McDonald's anymore, all that. But this is purely symbolic. It's affected certain industries. Maybe it may have to some extent affected the defense industry. They cannot produce certain weapon systems now, or at least on the volume they used to, because they are lacking parts and technology and software that comes from the West. But as far as oil is concerned, their oil exports have actually grown. According to the International Energy Agency, Russian oil exports have rebounded since April. I mean, they initially took a dip in March when the sanctions were first hit, and America, the United States banned Russian oil and all that, and a few others did. But they have rebounded since April. And we're talking about, they've risen by 620,000 barrels of oil per day, right? Russian oil exports, in spite of sanctions, or maybe because of the sanctions, have risen 620,000 barrels per day.
Per day?
Per day.
Oh,
and this is because this is available. There's a lot more trade into India and China.
It's the principal market.
Who are hoarding Russian oil, totally ignoring the sanctions. And not only that, but according to a very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal, they are actually mixing Russian oil. They are disguising Russian oil to export to other markets. And the Russian oil could be reaching Europe, the United States, and elsewhere, with disguised other gasoline, fuel, and diesel and chemical products, and sold on the spot market there, or at sea, or it can be transferred from one tanker to another at sea. They developed an entire infrastructure, an entire network on how to smuggle Russian oil throughout the world, how to disguise the origins of Russian oil to world markets. This is what is going on in India and China, and they are making a killing out of it. And as a result, Russian oil exports have increased by significant amounts, I may add.
Great.
And there's actually going to continue. It's going to grow. This whole industry of this whole underground Russian oil industry is going to grow. Because as a result of Europe, all right, okay, fine. Europe finally said, okay, that they're in 6 months' time, in 6 months, they're going to cease all imports of Russian oil. by ship, not by pipeline, by ship. And this is not gas, this is oil. Gas will continue for 2 more years at least. All right, they're going to ban European imports of Russian oil. Listen, all this does is give time, plenty of warning time for Russia, China, and India to develop a whole new logistical supply system to send the oil there. So it's very nice of the Europeans to do this. They're giving Russia a lot of time in which to reroute their exports to India and China. Fantastic. It's a great deal for Russia, Christian. This is really good news.
Really, a good deal.
For Russia, this is it's a windfall, it's a godsend.
A great business deal for Russia.
Yeah, hey, I wish we today could work as Russian oil dealers. So you could. That's where the new set of billionaires are going to come out of. Believe me. Okay. Ultimately, what you have to take into account is also, another factor that is coming this week. The Africa is now begging Russia to please allow grains to move out of Ukrainian ports and through the Black Sea into Africa. The head of the Organization of African Unity was in Moscow in a much publicized meeting with Putin, virtually begging him to avoid a famine in Africa. I expect Putin will probably concede to this to some extent, or he will use it in any way. He will use some kind of lifting of the blockade around Odessa. He may not, I don't know. But this will be an incredible diplomatic coup for Putin. And obviously he will use it to increase Russia's leverage in Africa. In Africa. This will be tremendous diplomatic leverage and economic leverage that Putin will develop in Africa if he allows Ukraine grain wheat exports to go to African countries to avoid what could be a very serious famine. It would also, I assume, fortify his position in the United Nations as well, because he's got the UN Secretary General also asking him to do this. So any concession to Putin on this would be seen as a tremendous diplomatic success for Russia in Africa, in the third world, and in international organizations. So, it is very difficult, Christian. I at the beginning of this whole thing, I had my serious doubts. It is very difficult to sanction a major producer of essential commodities, okay? You can sanction Cuba, you can sanction Venezuela,
Zimbabwe, Nicaragua.
No problem. But when you're talking about one of the world's major producer of commodities, of essential commodities, you're dealing with a very different. The rest of the world is not going to starve itself and destroy itself over Donbass. Okay, no one's going to do that, or Ukraine for that matter.
It's incredible.
So the sanctions policy against Russia have largely failed. Perhaps in the long run, I was interested in what the former head of MI6 had to say about this a while back when the whole thing started. That give it 2 years before the sanctions kick in. Maybe in the long run, who knows? But at the moment, the sanctions are having quite an opposite effect. Russian export and an international leverage on countries affected by the sanctions policy is actually growing. It's
incredible.
So it's a very tough play. And let me also point out another, figures talk. Numbers talk. Mathematics are the ultimate, are the ultimate ratio, the common denominator. Okay, the sanctions and the war have, it's affected Russia economically in global terms. Its GDP, its growth has decreased by 10%. Okay. Ukraine's growth by the war has decreased by 50% as a result of the war. Okay. So ultimately, who's losing, and who's winning? On who's got time on their side, right? As I say, it's incredible. Militarily, things continue not to go well for Russia. And I'm the first to say this, despite all the news headlines to the contrary that have appeared this week. But sanctions have not worked, and they're not going to work. And the main reason they're not working,
it's not working,
because of the self-inflicted energy embargo that the West has imposed upon itself through green policies. The United States has more gas and oil reserves than anywhere else in the world.
That's true.
Europe has gas reserves. It can do fracking, lots of things to increase its own energy production. The green policies, the push towards renewables, not push, more the forced march towards renewables, towards renewable energy sources, a lot of which don't work and cannot give nearly the degree of energy supply that fossil fuels can, has ruined or has totally diminished and undermined the Western capacity to deal with Russia's oil weapon. Okay, that is the reason Russia is able. That if Russia wins in Ukraine, it will be due to that. If Russia forces Ukraine to make concessions at the negotiating table, which sees them in great part of Ukrainian territory, it will be due to the green anti-fossil fuel policies of Western governments, fostered by this, I would call a sort of banking political syndicate, which has enforced these green policies against fossil fuels.
Economic is war.
Yeah, the West is waging economic war against itself. We're trying to wage economic war against Russia when we're in fact waging economic war against ourselves. It's incredible.
Incredible.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
It's incredible.
Anyway, on to Southeast Asia. I would, yes. I mean, Christian, do you have the figures there in front of you? I don't. Do you have them?
What?
The figures about the massive growth of synthetic drug trafficking in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, we start with talk about the synthetic drug.
Put up by the UNODC, the United Nations Organization Against Drugs and Crime. They're staggering. I mean, you're talking about a tenfold increase over a matter of a few years. Supposedly, a lot of this is coming out of the Golden Triangle: Laos, Burma, or what is it called now? Called Myanmar, and probably parts of Cambodia and northern Thailand, although drug production in Thailand has been significantly reduced from what it used to be. The DEA has been very active there. But Cambodia is something of no man's land, so I imagine it can't be too difficult to set up methamphetamine factories there. But I really think, Christian, in view of the fact that massive amounts of the methamphetamine, fentanyl, and other synthetic drugs, which have been going into Mexico for the U.S. To be smuggled into the U.S. market across the now neutralized southern border.
Principal hope is Mexico.
Come from China, so I would expect China might also be behind the growing production of synthetic drugs in Southeast Asia, in the Golden Triangle region. So it appears that China is definitely embarked on a policy of flooding the world with synthetic drugs, which they can manufacture in China completely in the dark, and nobody has any control over it, and they can produce at massive levels and flood the world with it. It's an incredible, it's a great source of revenue, black money for government officials that are behind this or that are allowing this. Chinese company involved with the Chinese Communist Party and the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. And also, it's interesting. I think the Chinese also see themselves as turning a page or using a page of the opium wars that were waged against China in the 19th century by European colonizers, mainly the British and the French, in which you may recall. It's an interesting historical precedent. Christian, it was a time when the British Empire was about to go broke, okay? They were about to go bankrupt. They were running out of silver because they had developed massive trade with China. They had gotten the European market, British and European market, a great demand for tea from China. And the Chinese policy which is highly centralized, it was a highly centralized system, demanded that Europe pay for tea or pay for any Chinese exports with silver bullion. They had to pay with silver. The only way they would sell to the Europeans was being paid with silver. This, of course, was exhausting the silver reserves of the British and other European powers. So they embarked on a policy of smuggling opium to China, which the British grew in parts of northern India, which is now Pakistan and Afghanistan. Same opium fields that are still operating today. All that was controlled by the British fought constant wars with local tribes to control the opium growing areas of those countries, to sell that opium to China, which was, of course, smuggled in, paid for in silver by Chinese traders, which they then used to buy Chinese products. and when China closed off its ports to the entry of opium, this triggered the Opium Wars. I mean, there was a war between China and the British, who had to keep those ports open so they could continue to trade with China, sell their opium, and take out Chinese products to Chinese silver, with which to buy tea.
Buy tea.
and these Opium Wars, they went on for a very long time. I mean, I think it was a 10-year, they were very prolonged. Well, I mean, there were many wars. They would sign a peace treaty that would open up, the Chinese would close the port, the British would take the port, then there would be a peace treaty to open the port, and the Chinese would close it again. It just went on and on and on for years. It was a secret war. I mean, the Royal Navy fought this in sort of on its own initiative, right? It was all very much managed and financed by the East India Company. It was a war that was off the books, but it went on, and it was a very prolonged war. The British were able to win because of the advent of steamships, which allowed them to move between the Chinese ports very quickly. They could move their gunboats between Hong Kong and Shanghai, say, before a Chinese army could move between Hong Kong and Shanghai. So they were able to eventually able to exhaust, run around and exhaust the Chinese army. And that is how it was fought. And yes, of course, this is how, the European powers managed to virtually carve out China. They managed to for a long time to control the Chinese economy. And I guess the Chinese now see that their massive drug trade, I suppose that's the way to have to put it, at an international scale, is they see this as a way of doing what the Europeans. Yeah. Okay, we got cut off there a moment. I was explaining about the Opium Wars. I may add, yes, I think the Chinese are sort of seeing this. Now that they're a great power, they're doing on to the West what the West did to them. And I may add, though, that while a lot of this ultimately goes to the United States via Mexico, they're the wrong people to take their revenge on, because America was not really part of the Opium Wars. their slice of the opium trade was quite minimal, and they were never participants in military efforts to force the opium trade with China. So, but anyway, that's how history goes. You often get those who pay the ultimate price for past sins, or those who did not commit the sins themselves. This is an unfortunate recurrent factor in international politics. Anyway, Christian, yes, I mean that's how I put it. I mean, obviously China is in the big, is in the international synthetic drugs business big time.
Big dealer of synthetic drugs.
Big deal.
Yeah,
big deal.
Is our report to United National Office of Drugs and Crime to report to June of 2022 about the synthetic drugs in East and Southeast Asia, less than the volume and child in 2022, confirms the extreme volumes of methamphetamines are begin producing, trafficking and use in the region, and the synthetic drugs trade continue to diversity. That's the big dealer.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. I don't know what more to add to that. Of course, the Golden Triangle, well, since Vietnam, of course, since the U.S. war in Vietnam, it's been a major producer of heroin initially. Initially it was heroin. And I imagine it's still coming out of there. A lot of poppies are grown in the highlands of Laos. But it's moving beyond that. And the instability in the region, especially the ongoing civil war in Myanmar, which is getting very little attention now as a result of but it's a very bloody and ongoing civil war between not just dissidents, ethnic groups targeted by the military junta in Rangoon. Of course, lends itself to creating large areas in which these factories, these production facilities can be set up, as well as these small client states that China can manipulate at will to provide whatever types of services they want them to provide.
So it's possible to talk about the new war for the criminal and drugs for United States and China in this moment with this volume of drugs and synthetic drugs across the world?
Frankly, Christian, I see there's very little acknowledgement. The United States is not making very much of the evidence of Chinese infiltration of international drug routes. There's very little acknowledgement about this by this administration, by the Biden administration. And they don't seem to be, it's not center stage in American policy at this moment. It is not mentioned as a major problematic area with China, despite the fact that the fentanyl is entering the United States in massive quantities and leading to a huge increase in the suicide rate among teenagers and other vulnerable or disadvantaged groups.
Others, yeah.
But I don't know, maybe on your end, but I don't really see any American effort, U.S. effort to counter China on this issue, on this activity.
Mm.
And of course, it's pretty ridiculous for the United States to start countering China's movement of fentanyl and methamphetamines into the United States across the Mexican border, when it is doing nothing to control the border. Okay.
For control the border,
that would be the first step. After that, perhaps we could get into rolling up the Chinese links with the Mexican cartels. But if they're allowing all this stuff to come in growing quantities without doing much about it, insofar as actually even closing the border to the trade and to the trafficking organizations that are moving this trade, then I see that it's very difficult for them to take any very proactive or additional steps against the international links that are allowing this trade.
Yes, it's true. The border is the more difficult control, because the ocean, the United States have more protection, but the control in the border is That's the point. That's the point.
There's no point in the ocean. Yeah, what's the point of the ocean? It all just goes to Mexico. Mexico gets shipped up,
Yeah.
and there's nobody there. There's nobody there. Hardly anybody there stopping it. I mean, very little control. Sure, they catch. What they catch is, I think last year they caught some 5,000 pounds. That's like 10,000 kilos. All right, that's what they caught. What got through has got to be over more than 10 times that.
Okay. You talk about the Canada lower money less podcast. Is connected with the synthetic drugs or other crimes?
No, apparently it's synthetic drugs. From a report written by a Canadian investigative journalist, okay, which has since been suppressed, but I read it before it was taken off of social media, and it actually got some play in certain aspects of certain parts of the Canadian media, mainstream. Was that Chinese officials involved in smuggling fentanyl to Mexico turn up for the payoffs in Canada, where cash money derived from the drugs is given to them in the forms of cash.
Yeah.
Which then they then use in local investments, especially in the area of Vancouver and British Columbia, and where they're also increasingly buying political favors. As you know, China has a lot of leverage in Canada. I mean, they managed to buy one of Canada's biggest lithium mining operations in Argentina through Canada. They managed to penetrate the lithium mining market in South America through Canada by buying up Canadian companies that were in charge of this. So China seems to be able to do pretty much whatever they want in Canada. They've got a very special relationship with the Trudeau, with Canada, and with people around Prime Minister Trudeau. That's the impression I have. Okay.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you so much. For conclusion, you have more about the news, about this podcast?
Well, Christian, let's keep at it. It's let's say what we're trying to do here is present a global perspective, with some depth about what happens in the world. It goes beyond the instant headlines or the fashionable news or the fashionable ideas. We penetrate deep. We say things that others don't want to hear. We don't dwell on conspiracies, but we don't deny that they exist. And this is the way our podcast will continue to do. And more people, I appeal to more people to subscribe, more people listen to us, and more people to maybe contribute to our ability to improve and expand the scope of our podcasts. Thank you very much, Christian, and thanks very much to your audience.
Thank you, Martin Arostegui. See you next podcast next weekend. Thank you. Subscribe all about the international security with Martin Arostegui, the special journalist. Thank you. See you again next week.